William and Catherine just stunned the entire United Kingdom, and indeed the watching world, by shattering decades of unspoken royal convention with a single devastating announcement that strikes at the very heart of the monarchy's future. A declaration so calculated, so surgically precise, and so breathtakingly final that it leaves King Charles III sitting in stunned, suffocating silence inside the very castle his mother once ruled with an iron hand. For years the Prince and Princess of Wales have been regarded as the dutiful heirs, the golden couple who smiled through every engagement and never once broke rank with the institution that made them. But behind the polished veneer of aristocratic composure, behind the coordinated outfits and the practiced waves, William and Catherine have been quietly, meticulously, and ruthlessly constructing a blueprint for a new monarchy. One that dismantles the very architecture of inherited courtly power that has sustained the House of Windsor for over a century. And when they finally unveiled that blueprint, they did so not with a press release, not through a spokesman's carefully sanitized statement, but face-to-face with the king himself, inside the private apartments of Windsor Castle, with the oak doors locked and the equerry dismissed. What exactly did William and Catherine propose that left Charles so shaken he could not speak for a full 90 seconds? Why did Catherine, the woman who has spent over 2 decades mastering the art of regal silence, choose this precise moment to draw a line so bold it effectively rewrites the rules of succession itself? And what devastating long-hidden truth about the future of Camilla's role finally compelled the next king and queen to act before it was too late? The morning had begun with a deceptive calm over Windsor Castle, the kind of pale, frost-laced October dawn that settles over Berkshire like a held breath. A thin mist clung to the long walk, obscuring the ancient oaks that line the approach to the castle's private entrance, and the only sound penetrating the medieval stone walls was the distant rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath the tires of a single black Range Rover, its windows tinted to opacity, gliding through the Henry VIII gate with the quiet authority of a vehicle that required no identification. Inside the castle's private apartments, specifically the oak drawing room on the eastern corridor, a cavernous, hauntingly quiet chamber lined with 17th-century Flemish tapestries, and dominated by a single mahogany writing desk that had once belonged to Queen Victoria. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood polish, and something fainter, more ephemeral, the trace of white freesias that Catherine had requested be placed in the room that morning, a detail so small it might have been overlooked by anyone who did not understand that Catherine never made a request without purpose. The Persian rug beneath the desk was a deep arterial crimson, its silk threads worn thin in places by centuries of royal footfall, and upon the desk itself sat a single cream-colored folder, its edges crisp, its surface unmarked save for a small embossed crest. Not the Prince of Wales feathers, not the royal cipher, but something altogether more personal, a discreet monogram bearing the intertwined initials W and C beneath a coronet that did not yet belong to them but soon, devastatingly soon would. The folder contained 7 pages that would reshape the British monarchy. William arrived first. He entered through the private corridor that connects the oak drawing room to the Augusta Tower staircase, a passage so narrow and so seldom used that the housekeeping staff had needed to clear cobwebs from the sconces the evening before. He was dressed with the kind of deliberate understatement that only a man raised inside the palace machinery could execute, a navy suit, no tie. The top button of his white shirt unfastened in a way that communicated not casualness but controlled informality, the sartorial equivalent of a man who has chosen his battlefield and dressed for it. His shoes, polished to a mirror finish, made no sound on the centuries-old stone floor. He crossed the room without hesitation, placed one hand flat on the surface of the mahogany desk, and stood there for a moment in absolute stillness, his jaw set, his blue eyes fixed on the cream-colored folder as though it contained not paper but the detonation sequence for an institution that had survived wars, abdications, scandals, and the slow erosion of deference, but might not survive this. Catherine arrived 3 minutes later, and those who claimed to understand the Princess of Wales from magazine covers and balcony appearances would not have recognized the woman who stepped into the oak drawing room that morning. She wore a structured charcoal blazer over a high-necked ivory blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that exposed the full architecture of her face, the cheekbones that the tabloids had rhapsodized over for 2 decades, yes, but also the set of her mouth, which was not smiling, not performing, not radiating the practiced warmth of 1,000 hospital visits and school openings, but drawn into a line so resolute it could have been carved from the same stone as the castle walls. She carried nothing in her hands. She needed nothing. Everything she required was already in the folder, and everything she intended to say had been rehearsed not in front of a mirror but in the silence of her own mind during the months of treatment and recovery that had stripped away every last vestige of pretense and left behind something the palace had never quite anticipated. A woman who was no longer afraid. They did not embrace when she entered the room. That detail, small as it may seem, would later be recounted by the single aide who witnessed the first minutes of the meeting. A woman whose name will never be made public but whose position within the Wales's household grants her a proximity to power that few outside the institution could comprehend. William and Catherine simply exchanged a look. The kind of look that is only possible between 2 people who have weathered public disintegration and private agony, and emerged not merely intact but fused into something harder, something more dangerous to the old order than any external threat. William nodded once. Catherine moved to the chair beside the desk, sat down with the fluid precision of a woman who had been taught deportment by the institution itself, and had now turned that very discipline into a weapon, and opened the cream-colored folder to its first page. The aide, standing near the doorway, later described the sound of that page turning as unnervingly loud in the silence. A crisp, decisive whisper that seemed to echo off the Flemish tapestries like a starter's pistol. King Charles arrived at 11 minutes past 10, precisely 4 minutes later than scheduled. A lapse that in the grammar of royal punctuality communicates not rudeness but unease. He was accompanied by a single equerry, a tall, angular man in a charcoal suit whose face betrayed nothing, the consummate palace operative, trained to be invisible, trained to absorb and observe and report, the kind of man who has existed in the corridors of British power since the Tudors, and whose loyalty is not to a person, but to the apparatus itself. Charles dismissed the equerry at the threshold with a gesture so slight it might have been a twitch, and the door closed behind him with a sound that the aide would later describe as final, the heavy oak settling into its frame with the authority of a vault. The king was dressed in a double-breasted suit of charcoal gray, a white shirt, a burgundy tie knotted with the precision of a man who has been dressed by valets since birth but who today, for reasons he might not have been able to articulate, had dressed himself. His signet ring caught the pale morning light as he extended his hand toward his son. And William took it, not with the formal handshake of sovereign and heir, but with the brief tight grip of a son who loves his father, and is about to wound him. Catherine rose from her chair, inclined her head with a fractional nod that honored protocol, while making it absolutely clear that protocol was not what this meeting was about, and gestured toward the third chair that had been positioned at the desk. 3 chairs around a desk built for one. The geometry of confrontation disguised as consultation. For the first 40 seconds, no one spoke. The only sound in the oak drawing room was the rhythmic tick of the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece, a clock that had measured time in this room since the reign of George IV, and that now counted out the seconds of a silence so charged it seemed to distort the very air. Charles looked at the folder. He looked at his son. He looked at Catherine. And then, with the weary prescience of a man who has spent his entire life waiting for the crown only to discover that wearing it means absorbing blow after blow, he rasped, his voice quiet, but edged with something that might have been resignation or might have been dread. "I take it this is not a social call." William did not smile. He pulled the folder gently toward his father, rotated it so the embossed monogram faced the king, and opened it to the first page, which bore a single heading in 12-point Garamond, a font chosen, one suspects, because it is the font of legal documents and academic papers, the font of things that cannot be argued with. The heading read, "Proposal for the Structural Reorganization of Working Royal Households Upon Accession." Charles read it once, read it again, and then he looked up at his son with an expression that the aide, pressed later for a precise description, could only characterize as the face of a man who has just been told the bridge he is standing on is about to be demolished, not in hostility, not in malice, but with the cold, compassionate efficiency of engineers who have determined it can no longer bear the weight. What followed over the next 90 minutes inside that room would, when its details eventually filtered through the impenetrable layers of royal discretion and reached the desks of senior correspondents at the BBC, ITV and the broadsheets, send shockwaves through every drawing room, every editorial office, and every palace corridor in the kingdom. William and Catherine had not come to Windsor Castle to ask permission. They had come to inform. And what they informed Charles of was nothing less than the controlled demolition of the institutional architecture that had sustained Camilla, Queen Consort, now Queen Camilla, as an independent center of royal power, and the establishment of a new doctrine that would, upon Charles's death or abdication, consolidate the entire working apparatus of the monarchy under a single household, the household of King William V and Queen Catherine. The proposal was 7 pages long, but its core principle could be stated in a single devastating sentence. When the next reign begins, there will be no separate court, no independent office, no autonomous institutional machinery for the Dowager Queen. Catherine explained it herself, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular clarity of a woman who has spent months in proximity to mortality, and emerged with an understanding of power that is unclouded by sentiment. She told Charles that the proposal was not personal, was not aimed at Camilla as a woman or a wife or a stepmother, but at the structural reality of what happens when a reign ends and a new one begins. She referenced, with the precision of someone who has done exhaustive research, the historical precedent of Queen Alexandra, who upon the death of Edward VII in 1910, maintained a separate household at Sandringham that operated as a parallel center of influence for years, creating confusion, divided loyalties among courtiers, and a drain on the privy purse that took the new King George V the better part of a decade to resolve. She referenced Queen Mary, who after the death of George V was careful to subordinate her household to that of her son, but who nonetheless retained a staff of over 40, and a social calendar that occasionally placed her in direct, if unintentional competition with Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, for public attention. And then she referenced the Queen Mother herself, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the most beloved dowager in modern British history, whose separate establishment at Clarence House persisted for 50 years after the death of George VI, a half-century of independent operation that cost the public purse tens of millions of pounds, and created an entire sub-institution within the monarchy, complete with its own private secretary, its own press office, its own household accounts, and its own internal culture of loyalty that sometimes ran counter to the interests of the reigning sovereign. Charles listened. He listened with the stillness of a man who has been trained since childhood to absorb information before reacting, to let the full weight of an argument settle before offering a response, a discipline instilled in him by his mother, who had been, whatever else history might say about her, the supreme practitioner of the long silence. But the aide noticed that as Catherine spoke, as the historical precedents accumulated like bricks in a wall, Charles's right hand, the hand bearing the signet ring of the sovereign, began to tremble, a fine, almost imperceptible vibration that he attempted to still by pressing his palm flat against the desk, a gesture that only drew attention to what it was meant to conceal. William took over from Catherine with the seamless coordination of two people who have rehearsed their positions so thoroughly that the handoff is invisible. He told his father that the proposal was not merely about cost or efficiency, though both were factors. He told him that it was about clarity. The clarity that the monarchy desperately needed after decades of institutional confusion, divided households, competing agendas, and the slow, corrosive erosion of public trust that occurs when the British people cannot determine who speaks for the crown and who speaks for themselves. He told Charles that he had studied, with the help of constitutional historians and senior legal advisors whose names he did not disclose, the structural failures that had plagued every transition of reign since Victoria's death in 1901, and that in every case, every single case, the persistence of a dowager's independent court had created friction, expense and reputational risk. He told his father that he loved Camilla, that he respected what she had done for Charles and for the institution, and that none of what he was proposing diminished her personally. But he also told him, in a voice that had dropped to barely above a whisper but that carried in the silent room with the force of a cannon shot, that when the time came, and they all understood that when, was not if, but a matter of years, perhaps fewer years than any of them wished to contemplate, the transition had to be clean, surgical, absolute. The word absolute hung in the air of the oak drawing room like smoke after a detonation. Charles did not respond immediately. He turned the pages of the proposal, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs, the footnotes citing constitutional conventions, the appendices containing financial projections and organizational charts that reduced the sprawling centuries-old machinery of royal households to neat boxes and dotted lines. And then he reached page 5, and he stopped. He stopped because page 5 contained the clause that Catherine had insisted upon, the clause that transformed the proposal from a targeted restructuring of Camilla's future into something far more radical, far more principled, and far more difficult for anyone, including the press, including Camilla's allies, including the old guard of the palace, to dismiss as a personal vendetta. Page 5 stated, in language that was as precise as a legal instrument and as unyielding as forged steel, that the single household principle would apply not only to Camilla but to Catherine herself. If William were to predecease her, if she were to find herself in the position of Dowager Queen, she would not expect, would not accept, and would not permit the establishment of a separate court in her name. She would subordinate herself entirely to the household of the next sovereign. She was not asking Camilla to accept a diminishment that she herself was unwilling to bear. She was setting a precedent. She was, in the language of the document, establishing the principle that institutional authority derives solely from the reigning sovereign and does not survive the reign from which it was granted. Charles read page 5 twice. He read it a third time. And then he looked at Catherine with an expression that the aide could not quite categorize. It contained admiration, certainly, because Charles is a man who recognizes strategic brilliance when he encounters it, but it also contained something rawer, something closer to grief, because he understood in that moment that his son and daughter-in-law had not merely outmaneuvered the old guard, had not merely anticipated every possible objection and neutralized it in advance, but had done something that he himself, in over 70 years of preparation for the throne, had never quite managed to do. They had defined what the monarchy should be, not what it was, not what tradition demanded, not what the courtiers whispered was possible, but what it should be. And in doing so they had drawn a line that separated the future from the past, with the finality of a door closing. The memory hit William without warning, the way these things always do, not summoned but arriving unbidden, triggered by the quality of the light in the oak drawing room, the pale morning sun slanting through the mullioned windows at precisely the angle it had slanted through the windows of the nursery at Kensington Palace in the autumn of 1995, when he was 13 years old and the world was still, despite everything, a place where his mother's voice could make anything bearable. He remembered sitting on the floor of that nursery, his back against the radiator, the warmth of it seeping through his school shirt, and his mother perched on the edge of the window seat with her legs tucked beneath her in that way she had, the way that made her look not like the most photographed woman in the world but like a girl, like someone's older sister, like someone who might at any moment suggest they abandon whatever they were supposed to be doing and go get ice cream instead. She had been talking about the future, not her future, which by then was already a landscape of legal battles and tabloid sieges and the slow, agonizing dismantlement of a marriage that had been, from its first moment, less a union than a transaction. But his future, the future that would come whether he wanted it or not, the future that wore a crown. And she had said something that he had carried with him every day since, something that he had never repeated to a journalist, never shared with a biographer, never whispered even to Catherine until the night she came home from the hospital and they sat together in the darkness of their bedroom at Adelaide Cottage, and he told her everything, every secret, every fear, every promise he had made to a woman who had been dead for 27 years. Diana had leaned forward, taken his face in her hands, her fingers cool, always cool, smelling faintly of Quelques Fleurs, the perfume she wore even at home, even when no one was watching, and she had said, in that voice that could shift from laughter to devastating seriousness in the space of a breath, "William, darling, when it's your turn, you must build the walls smaller. Do you understand me? Smaller walls, fewer rooms, fewer people who can hide in them." He hadn't understood. He was 13. He was thinking about football, and whether his mother would let him stay up to watch the late film. But the words had lodged in him the way only a mother's words can, not in the mind but somewhere deeper, somewhere structural, and they had stayed there, dormant and patient, until the morning he sat in the oak drawing room at Windsor Castle with a 7-page document on the desk, and his father's trembling hand beside it. And he understood at last, with a clarity that was almost blinding, exactly what she had meant. Smaller walls, fewer rooms, fewer people who can hide in them. The silence that followed Charles's reading of page 5 lasted long enough for the Ormolu clock to chime the half-hour, 10:30. A sound so familiar within those walls that it should have been comforting but that instead, in the charged stillness of the room, seemed to toll with the gravity of a cathedral bell. Charles set the folder down, aligned its edges with the edge of the desk in a gesture of almost compulsive precision, and then he spoke, and his voice, when it came, was not angry, was not imperious, was not the voice of a king addressing his subjects but the voice of a man. A 76-year-old man. A man who had waited longer for his throne than any monarch in British history. A man who had buried his mother and taken her crown and discovered that the crown was heavier than he had ever imagined, speaking to his son and his daughter-in-law with a weariness so profound it seemed to emanate from his bones. He said, quietly, "You understand what you are asking me to accept." It was not a question. William met his father's gaze without flinching. "I understand what I am asking you to consider," he replied. And the distinction, the precise, lawyerly distinction between accept and consider, was not lost on anyone in the room, least of all Charles, who recognized in his son's careful language the same diplomatic exactitude that his own mother had wielded like a scalpel for 70 years. Catherine intervened then, and she did so with a grace that belied the devastating precision of what she was about to say. She told Charles that she wanted him to understand something about the proposal that the document itself could not fully convey. She told him that she had spent the past year, the year of her treatment, the year of her absence from public life, the year that the tabloids had filled with speculation and the palace had filled with silence, thinking about what the monarchy means, not in the abstract, not as a constitutional scholar might define it, but as a woman who had entered it as an outsider, and who had spent 2 decades learning its architecture from the inside, learning where the load-bearing walls are, and where the decorative facades conceal nothing but empty space. And she told him that what she had concluded, after months of thought that were sharpened by the particular clarity that comes from confronting one's own mortality, was that the monarchy's greatest vulnerability is not republicanism, not public apathy, not the relentless scrutiny of the press, but the proliferation of courts, the tendency, embedded in centuries of tradition, for every generation to spawn new households, new staffs, new centers of authority that compete with one another for resources, for attention, and for the loyalty of the men and women who serve the crown. She told him that every scandal, every crisis, every fracture in the royal family's public image in the past 50 years could be traced, if you followed the thread far enough, to the existence of multiple competing households. The Queen's household against Charles's household, Charles's household against Diana's household, William's household against Harry's household, each with its own private secretary, its own communications team, its own agenda, its own version of events. And she told him, with a steadiness that did not waver, that she and William were determined to end it, not gradually, not with a phased transition over decades, but decisively, structurally, and permanently, beginning with the principle that when Charles's reign ends, whatever institutional apparatus surrounds Camilla ends with it. The king's face in that moment was a study in the particular agony of a man caught between love and logic. He loved Camilla. That was never in question and was not in question now. He had fought for her, had endured decades of public vilification for her, had defied his own mother's wishes and the advice of every courtier in the palace to be with her, and the idea that his death would consign her to institutional irrelevance, not personally, not socially, but structurally, was a wound that the proposal's clinical language could not anesthetize. But he was also, beneath the sentimentality that the British public had always perceived as his defining characteristic, a man of formidable intellectual honesty, and he could see, could not avoid seeing, because William and Catherine had constructed their argument with the remorselessness of architects who have accounted for every structural stress, that the principle was sound. The principle was in fact unanswerable. If the monarchy was to survive the 21st century, if it was to mean anything to a generation that had grown up watching the institution tear itself apart in public, then the accretion of parallel courts, parallel loyalties, parallel versions of the truth had to stop. And it had to stop not with a memo, not with a gentleman's agreement, not with the kind of informal understanding that the palace had always relied upon and that had always, inevitably been betrayed by the next generation's ambitions, but with a formal structural commitment embedded in the operational framework of the next reign. Somewhere in the castle, the aide could not determine exactly where. Perhaps the equerry's anteroom, perhaps the private secretary's office on the floor below. A telephone rang. It rang 3 times and then stopped, and the abruptness of the silence that followed was somehow more unsettling than the ringing itself, as though someone had answered it and received news that required immediate, wordless absorption. Charles glanced toward the door. William did not. Catherine did not. They had anticipated interruptions. They had in fact anticipated everything. The conversation that followed the initial reading of the proposal lasted another 70 minutes, and its details, pieced together from fragments that emerged over the following weeks through sources so deeply embedded in the palace infrastructure that their identities will likely never be confirmed, reveal a negotiation of extraordinary emotional complexity conducted with the restraint and precision of a diplomatic summit. Charles raised objections, not to the principle, which he conceded was historically defensible, but to the implications. He asked what would happen to Camilla's existing staff, the 37 men and women who currently serve the Queen's household, people who had given years of their lives to the institution, and who would, under the Wales's proposal, face either redeployment to the unified household, or redundancy upon the transition of reign. Catherine had anticipated the question. She produced a supplementary document, this one from a separate folder that had been placed beneath the first, a detail that suggested the entire presentation had been choreographed with the attention to staging of a theatrical production, outlining a transition plan that guaranteed every member of Camilla's current staff a position within the consolidated household, or, for those who preferred to leave, a severance package funded not from the public purse but from the Duchy of Cornwall's private income. The message was unmistakable. This was not the crown cutting costs at the expense of loyal servants. This was the next generation assuming full financial responsibility for the consequences of its own decisions. Charles asked about Camilla's public role. Would she be expected to withdraw from engagements? Would she be confined to whatever private residence she chose, a dowager in gilded exile? William shook his head. He explained that the proposal drew a sharp, deliberate line between personal freedom and institutional authority. Camilla would be free to attend events, to support causes, to live wherever she wished and however she wished, and the royal family would continue to honor her publicly as Queen Dowager, but she would not have a household. She would not have a private secretary who reported to her, rather than to the king. She would not have a press office capable of issuing statements that could diverge from the palace's unified communications. She would be, in the framework of the proposal, a beloved member of the family but not an independent node of institutional power. The distinction was subtle, and it was everything. A memory surfaced for Catherine then, rising through the careful architecture of her composure like a bubble through still water. She was back at Bucklebury, in the kitchen of her parents' house, the autumn light falling through the window above the sink, and her mother, Carol, was standing at the counter with a mug of tea cradled in both hands, and Catherine had just told her. This was 2011, just months before the wedding, before the Abbey, before the billion viewers and the dress and the balcony and the life that would follow, that she was frightened. Not of William, never of William, but of what she was about to enter. The sheer institutional mass of it, the machinery that would surround her every waking moment and that she would never, not once, be permitted to fully control. And Carol, who is not a woman given to grand pronouncements but who possesses the particular wisdom of someone who has built something from nothing, had set down her tea and said, simply, then learn the machine, learn every gear, every lever, every bolt. And when the time comes, you'll know which ones to remove. Catherine had laughed, because it sounded like something out of a film, but Carol had not laughed. And the look in her mother's eyes had been the look of a woman who understood that her daughter was about to enter a world where knowledge was the only reliable form of protection. And now, 23 years later, sitting in the oak drawing room, with the proposal on the desk and the king's resistance slowly, agonizingly yielding to the logic of its arguments, Catherine understood that she had done exactly what her mother had told her to do. She had learned the machine. She knew which bolts to remove, and she was removing them. The most devastating moment of the meeting came not during the discussion of structure or finance or historical precedent, but during a passage of conversation so personal, so raw, that even the aide who witnessed it hesitated before describing it, aware that some wounds, once exposed to air, never fully close. Charles had been silent for several minutes, his eyes on the proposal but his attention clearly elsewhere, in some interior landscape of memory and calculation, and then he said, without looking up, "She will feel abandoned." The she required no clarification. William leaned forward, and what he said next was delivered in a tone that the aide described as the most controlled display of emotion she had ever witnessed. Not cold, not clinical, but held, as though he were carrying something fragile across a room full of obstacles and could not afford a single misstep. "She will feel loved," William said. "She will feel honored. She will feel free. What she will not feel, what no one in this family should ever again have to feel, is the weight of an institution that does not belong to them pressing down on them after the person who brought them into it is gone. That is not love, that is architecture. And architecture can be changed." Charles's eyes glistened. The aide saw it clearly, the sudden, involuntary brightness that precedes tears in a man who has been taught since birth that tears are a private indulgence, never to be displayed, never to be acknowledged, and certainly never to be shed in the presence of those who will one day succeed you. But the tears did not fall. They gathered at the rims of his eyes and held there, suspended by decades of discipline, and Charles blinked once, twice, and they were gone, reabsorbed into the composure that is both the armor and the cage of every member of his family. He placed both hands flat on the desk, the signet ring catching the light once more, and he said, in a voice that was barely audible, "I need to think." William nodded. Catherine closed the folder. The meeting was over, or rather, the formal presentation was over. What began in its aftermath was something far more complex, far more dangerous to the established order, and far more consequential than anything that had been said inside the oak drawing room. Because the moment Charles uttered the words, "I need to think," the information began to move. Not through official channels, not through the private secretary's office, not through the communications team at Buckingham Palace, not through the carefully managed network of accredited royal correspondents who function as the monarchy's semi-official conduits to public opinion, but through the other network, the older network, the invisible web of courtiers, aides, valets, dressers, and household staff whose whispered conversations in back corridors and service kitchens have shaped the destiny of the British crown for centuries. The men in grey. Within 4 hours of the meeting's conclusion, a man whose name does not appear on any public organizational chart, but whose influence within the palace machinery is, by the account of those who have operated within its orbit, second only to that of the private secretary himself, was sitting in a leather armchair in a first-floor office at St. James's Palace. A room so deliberately unremarkable, beige walls, functional desk, no paintings, no personal effects, that it might have been designed to be forgotten the moment you left it. He was a man in his early 60s, of medium height and medium build, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes the color of slate that revealed nothing and observed everything. His suit was charcoal, impeccably cut, and his shoes were polished Oxfords that clicked with metronomic precision on the marble floors of the palace corridors. He held no formal title that would be recognized by the public. His business card, if he possessed one, would identify him by a designation so generic, senior advisor, household operations, that it would tell you absolutely nothing about the true scope of his authority. But within the walls of the institution, he was known, understood and feared, because he was the man who managed transitions, and by transitions the palace did not mean the simple logistical exercise of moving from one reign to another but the far more delicate, far more treacherous process of ensuring that power, real power, the kind of power that determines who speaks for the crown and who is spoken about, passed from one generation to the next without disruption to the machinery that he had spent his entire career maintaining. This man had been present, in one capacity or another, for every significant internal upheaval since the late 1990s. He had been a junior aide during the catastrophe of Diana's death, had watched from the margins as the palace's response, the empty flagpole, the delayed return to London, the catastrophic misreading of public grief, nearly brought the institution to its knees. He had learned from that disaster not the lesson that most people learned, which was that the palace needed to be more human, more responsive, more attuned to the emotions of the nation, but a different lesson entirely, a colder lesson, a lesson that had guided his every decision in the decades since, that the institution's survival depends not on its humanity, but on its architecture, and that architecture must be defended at all costs, against all threats, including threats that come from within the royal family itself. He had received the details of the Wales's proposal within 90 minutes of the meeting's end, relayed to him by the equerry who had been dismissed at the oak drawing-room threshold, but who had, in the manner of all good palace operatives, positioned himself close enough to the door to catch the essential contours of the conversation. And what this man understood, with the instantaneous pattern recognition of someone who has spent 4 decades reading the internal politics of the monarchy, was that the proposal was not merely a reorganization. It was an eviction notice. It was, beneath its constitutional language and its historical footnotes and its elegant invocation of precedent, a declaration that the apparatus he had helped build, the Queen's household, with its 37 staff members, its independent communications capability, its own budget line, its own internal loyalty structure, would cease to exist upon the death of the king. And that was not in his calculation a matter of principle, it was a matter of power, and power once conceded, is never voluntarily returned. He made 3 telephone calls in the hour that followed. The first was to a member of the Privy Council whose sympathies lay with the traditional structure. The second was to a senior figure in the Church of England, whose relationship with Camilla was built on decades of quiet mutual support. The third was to a journalist, not a royal correspondent, who would be too visible, but a political columnist at a broadsheet, whose willingness to publish strategically timed opinion pieces had been cultivated over years of carefully rationed access and off-the-record briefings. The content of these calls was never recorded, and will never be confirmed, but their effect became visible within 48 hours, when a column appeared in a Sunday newspaper, unsigned in spirit if not in fact, its arguments so perfectly aligned with the palace's institutional interests, that they might have been dictated rather than written, suggesting that certain elements within the next generation of the royal family were engaged in a power grab that threatened the stability of the crown and the dignity of the Queen. The column did not name William or Catherine. It did not need to. The architecture of implication is one of the oldest tools in the palace's arsenal, and the man in the charcoal suit wielded it with the precision of a surgeon. But what neither the man in the charcoal suit, nor the journalist, nor the Privy Council member, nor the Church of England figure understood, what none of them could have anticipated, because none of them had been present in the oak drawing-room, and none of them had read page 5, was that William and Catherine had built a failsafe into their proposal. And the failsafe was Catherine herself. The news cycle moved with the velocity and chaos that characterizes modern royal coverage, a cascade of speculation, counter-speculation, anonymous briefings, and breathless commentary that transformed the drawing rooms and editorial offices of Britain into a theatre of conjecture within 72 hours of the Windsor Castle meeting. Across pubs in Edinburgh and Manchester, pint glasses paused mid-lift as television screens displayed the familiar rotating carousel of royal analysts, each offering their interpretation of the leak, each speculating about what the Waleses had proposed, and what the king's response had been, while the principals themselves, William, Catherine, Charles, Camilla, maintained the immaculate public silence that is the monarchy's most powerful and most maddening weapon. But behind that silence, behind the official no comment that Buckingham Palace issued with the practiced blandness of an institution that has been saying no comment since before the term existed, a second conversation was taking place, and it was this conversation, not the public spectacle, that would determine the outcome. Catherine made a telephone call. She made it from the private sitting room at Adelaide Cottage, a room so modest by royal standards that visitors to the house have been known to mistake it for a waiting area. With its cream-colored walls, its single bookshelf lined with art history volumes and children's paperbacks in equal measure, and its view across the fields toward the castle that housed the king whose reign her proposal would reshape. She called not a courtier, not an advisor, not a press strategist, but a woman, and the identity of this woman is perhaps the most closely guarded detail of the entire episode, known to fewer than 5 people, none of whom have any intention of confirming it. What is known, or can be reasonably inferred from the sequence of events that followed, is that this woman occupied a position of unique proximity to Camilla herself, not as a member of her household but as something more personal, more trusted, a friend in the fullest sense of the word, someone to whom Camilla had confided fears and frustrations and hopes that she would never articulate to a courtier or a private secretary. Catherine spoke to this woman for 22 minutes. The substance of the conversation was never disclosed, but its effect was immediate and unmistakable. Within 24 hours, the anonymous briefings from the old guard ceased, the opinion columns dried up. The whisper campaign that the man in the charcoal suit had orchestrated with such practiced efficiency simply stopped, as though someone had located the power cable and pulled it from the wall. What Catherine had done, in that 22-minute call, was something that the institutional operators of the palace had not considered possible, because it violated every precedent in their experience. She had gone directly to Camilla. Not through channels, not through intermediaries, not through the elaborate diplomatic rituals that govern communication between royal households, but directly, woman to woman, through the one channel that no institution can monitor or control, the channel of personal trust. And what she had communicated to Camilla, through the intermediary of this trusted friend, was not a threat, not an ultimatum, not a negotiating position, but a promise. The promise was this, that the proposal was not designed to diminish Camilla, was not motivated by the ancient rivalry between Diana's memory and Charles's second wife, was not an act of revenge or retribution or institutional cruelty, but was in its deepest intention an act of liberation. Catherine was telling Camilla that she was freeing her, that she was offering her something that no queen consort in British history had ever been offered, the chance to step away from the machinery, to live the final chapter of her life not as a figure embedded in an institutional apparatus that would demand her presence, her participation, and her submission to protocols and schedules and the relentless grinding obligation of public service, but as a private woman, a grandmother, a reader, a lover of horses and dogs in the countryside, a woman who had done her duty and could now, with the formal blessing of the next generation, set it down. And then Catherine had added the detail that sealed it. The detail that transformed the conversation from a diplomatic overture into something that Camilla, according to the sequence of events that followed, found impossible to resist. Catherine told her about page 5. She told Camilla that the same principle, the absolute dissolution of a dowager's institutional apparatus, would apply to Catherine herself. That she was not asking Camilla to accept something she was unwilling to bear. That she was in effect standing beside her and saying, "We will both be free." The effect on Camilla was by every indication profound. Here was a woman who had spent 2 decades being characterized by the press and the public as the villain of the greatest royal love story of the 20th century. A woman who had endured hatred so intense and so personal that she had required therapy to manage the psychological toll. A woman who had, through sheer persistence and the particular British genius for rehabilitation through quiet, steady public service, clawed her way from national pariah to queen. And now she was being offered, by the very woman who might have been expected to resent her most, not a diminishment but a gift. The gift of smallness. The gift of walls brought close. The gift, if she chose to accept it, of finally being allowed to be simply herself. 3 days after Catherine's telephone call, Charles received a communication from Camilla that, according to sources whose access to the private correspondence of the royal family has been demonstrated repeatedly over decades, consisted of a single handwritten note on her personal stationery, cream-colored, edged in pale green, bearing the cipher QC beneath a crown. The note was brief. It said, in essence, that she had thought about it, and that she understood, and that she supported the proposal, with one condition, that the transition be handled with dignity, that her staff be treated with generosity, and that the public narrative, when it eventually emerged, make clear that she had consented freely and was not being forced out. Charles read the note in his study at Clarence House, alone, at 9:30 in the evening, with a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him and the curtains drawn against a London night that was, by the account of the weather records, unseasonably warm for the time of year. He read it once, folded it, placed it inside the breast pocket of his jacket, and sat for a long time in silence. What he felt in that silence, whether it was relief or grief, or the complex, bittersweet recognition that his son and daughter-in-law had accomplished in 3 weeks what he had been unable to accomplish in 3 decades, the simplification of the monarchy's internal architecture, will likely never be known, because Charles is a man who reserves his deepest emotions for his private journals, and those journals, by his own instruction, will not be opened until long after his death. The call came at 20 minutes to midnight. William was in the kitchen at Adelaide Cottage, a mug of chamomile tea cooling on the counter, his phone face down on the table in the way of a man who has decided that whatever comes next will come in its own time. Catherine was upstairs, checking on the children, George asleep with a book still open on his chest, Charlotte curled in her blankets with the mathematical precision of a child who organizes even her sleep, Louis sprawled across his bed in the glorious unself-conscious abandon of the youngest. The phone buzzed once against the wooden surface, and William picked it up, and the voice on the other end was his father's, and it was a voice that William had heard in every register, commanding, warm, petulant, wounded, joyful, regal, but never quite like this. It was the voice of a man who had surrendered something and was still measuring the weight of what he had let go. Charles said, "I've spoken with Camilla." William closed his eyes, and there was a pause, 3 seconds, 4, 5, during which the only sound was the faint, electronic hiss of the encrypted connection and, somewhere in the background of Charles's study, the tick of a clock that might have been the same ormolu clock from the oak drawing room, or might have been another clock entirely, because palaces are full of clocks, each one counting down a different kind of time. Then Charles said, his voice cracking on the final syllable like ice giving way beneath a careful step, "She agrees. We both agree. God help us all, we agree." William did not speak for a moment. He pressed his free hand against the kitchen counter, the cool granite grounding him in the present, in the reality of what had just happened, and he thought, he could not help thinking, of a nursery at Kensington Palace, and the warmth of a radiator against his back, and a woman with cool fingers and the scent of Quelques fleurs saying, "Smaller walls, darling, fewer rooms." And then he said, his voice steady but soft, the voice of a son who has kept a promise he made when he was too young to understand what it meant, "Thank you, Papa." The line went dead. Not with the sharp click of a disconnected call, but with the slow, fading diminishment of a signal losing strength, as though the conversation were not ending but dissolving, returning to the silence from which it had emerged. William set the phone down on the counter. He stood there for a long time, in the quiet kitchen, with the mug of chamomile going cold, and the house settling around him with the gentle, almost imperceptible sounds that old buildings make at night, the creak of timber, the whisper of settling stone, the pulse of a structure that has endured and will endure. Catherine appeared in the doorway. She did not ask what had been said. She looked at his face and she knew. She crossed the kitchen, placed one hand on his arm, and they stood there together, two people in a modest cottage on the grounds of a castle, having just reshaped the future of an institution that had existed for 1,000 years, and the magnitude of it, the sheer dizzying, almost incomprehensible magnitude of what they had set in motion, pressed down on the silence like the weight of centuries. In the days that followed, the machinery began to move. Not the palace machinery. That apparatus was, for once, several steps behind. But the machinery of William and Catherine's own design, the quiet, precise, ruthlessly efficient operation that they had built over years, with a staff selected not for their pedigree or their connections, but for their competence, their discretion, and their absolute, unshakable loyalty to the Wales's vision of what the monarchy could become. The proposal was formalized. Legal advisors reviewed it. Constitutional experts weighed in. Their opinions sought not through official channels, but through private consultations arranged with the discretion of a covert operation. The financial projections were stress-tested. The transition plan for Camilla's staff was refined, expanded, and undergirded with guarantees so comprehensive that even the most dedicated critic would find it difficult to characterize the move as callous. And through it all, through every meeting, and every document, and every whispered consultation, page 5 remained the keystone of the entire edifice, Catherine's pledge that the principle applied to her too, that she was not carving out an exception for herself, but establishing a rule for everyone, a rule that said, when a reign ends, its institutional apparatus ends with it, and the new sovereign begins not with the accumulated weight of previous courts pressing down upon them, but with a clean slate, a single household, a unified voice. The man in the charcoal suit at St. James's Palace learned of Camilla's consent 48 hours after it was given, and by then it was too late. The architecture he had spent decades constructing, the web of loyalties, the informal networks, the carefully cultivated relationships with journalists and politicians and church figures that gave the Queen's household its independent gravitational pull, had been rendered not destroyed but irrelevant, which is, in the calculus of power, something far worse than destruction, because destruction leaves rubble that can be rebuilt, while irrelevance leaves nothing at all. He sat in his beige office, in his leather armchair, with his polished Oxfords planted on the floor, and his hands folded in his lap, and he understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has spent his life reading the currents of institutional power, that the game had changed. Not the players, not the rules, but the game itself. The next generation had not merely won a battle within the existing framework, they had replaced the framework, and there was no counter-move available to him, because the most devastating aspect of the Wales's strategy was its moral symmetry. Page 5, Catherine's self-imposed limitation. The principle applied equally and without exception, which meant that any attempt to characterize the proposal as a power grab or a personal vendetta would collapse the moment it encountered the fact that the woman proposing it had voluntarily surrendered the same privilege she was asking Camilla to relinquish. It was, he recognized with a grudging admiration he would never express aloud, perfect. It was architecturally perfect. They had built a structure that could not be attacked because it attacked itself preemptively, sacrificing its own future privileges to establish the legitimacy of its present demands. And in doing so, they had rendered every weapon in his considerable arsenal useless. The news broke on a Tuesday. Though broke is perhaps too violent a word for the way it entered the public consciousness, it was more like a dawn. A gradual brightening that began with a single carefully worded statement from Kensington Palace, released at 9 a.m. Time to catch the morning news cycle at its peak receptiveness. The statement was 3 paragraphs long and said, with the understated precision that is the hallmark of communications crafted by people who understand that in royal messaging, what is not said is as important as what is, that the Prince and Princess of Wales had, in consultation with His Majesty the King and Her Majesty the Queen, agreed upon a framework for the structural organization of the monarchy upon the accession of the next sovereign, a framework designed to ensure clarity, efficiency, and the seamless continuation of public service. It mentioned the single household principle. It mentioned the historical precedents. It mentioned, crucially, that the principle would apply universally to all future dowager consorts, including the Princess of Wales herself. And it concluded with a sentence that, for those who understood the grammar of royal communication, was as close to a revolution as the monarchy had produced since the abdication crisis of 1936. This framework represents the shared conviction of the current and future sovereign that the institution of the monarchy is best served by a unified structure that derives its authority solely from the reigning king or queen. 20 million people saw the statement within the first hour. By midday, it was the leading story on every news outlet in the English-speaking world, and by evening it had generated more online discussion than any royal announcement since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And across that vast, churning ocean of commentary, the television panels, the social media threads, the pub conversations, the dinner table debates, one detail surfaced again and again, cited by supporters and critics alike as the single most remarkable aspect of the entire affair. It was page 5. It was Catherine. It was the fact that a woman who stood to benefit enormously from the existing system, who could, if she chose, look forward to decades as a powerful independent dowager queen with her own household, her own staff, her own institutional machinery, had voluntarily, preemptively, and irrevocably surrendered that future. Not because she was asked, not because she was pressured, but because she believed, with the unshakable conviction of a woman who had stared into the abyss of her own mortality, and returned with her vision clarified, that the monarchy could not survive another century of accumulated courts and competing households and institutional proliferation. She had built smaller walls, she had removed the bolts, and she had done it not just for the future but for the past, for a woman who had once leaned forward in a nursery at Kensington Palace and taken a boy's face in her cool perfumed hands, and said the words that would, 29 years later, reshape the oldest continuous institution in the Western world. The final image of this extraordinary chapter in the life of the British monarchy is not a public one. It is not the statement on Kensington Palace's website, not the breathless newsreaders, not the millions of screens displaying the same 3 paragraphs in the same measured font. It is a private image, seen by no one outside the family, described only in fragments by those whose access to the inner life of the Waleses permits occasional glimpses through the fortress of their privacy. It is the image of Catherine, late in the evening of the day the statement was released, sitting alone in the garden of Adelaide Cottage, with a blanket around her shoulders, and the last light of the day fading over the long walk. The children were in bed. William was inside, on the phone with his brother, a conversation whose content will remain private, but whose tone, by every indication, was one of the most emotional exchanges the 2 men had shared in years. The garden was quiet. The only sound the distant intermittent call of a wood pigeon, and the rustle of leaves in a breeze that carried the first chill of autumn. Catherine sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the darkening sky, and she breathed, not the careful, measured breathing of a woman performing calm, but the deep, involuntary shuddering breath of a woman who has carried something heavy for a very long time, and has at last set it down. And if you had been there, if you had been standing at the edge of the garden, looking in, you might have seen, just before the light failed entirely, the faintest trace of a smile on her face, the smile of a woman who has kept a promise that was not originally hers to keep, but that she had taken on, willingly, absolutely, because she understood that some promises are bigger than the people who make them, and outlast the lives that give them meaning. Buckingham Palace issued no further comment. Clarence House was silent. St. James's Palace, where a man in a charcoal suit sat alone in a beige office with the lights off, was dark. Across the United Kingdom, from the pubs of Edinburgh to the living rooms of Cardiff, from the newsrooms of Fleet Street to the quiet corridors of Westminster, the conversation continued, would continue for weeks, for months, perhaps for years. But the decision was made, the document was signed, and the architecture of the future was set. Smaller walls, fewer rooms, fewer places to hide. The monarchy would go on, as it always had, but it would go on changed, stripped of the accumulated institutional weight of generations, lighter, leaner, and shaped at last not by the men in grey who had governed its shadows for centuries, but by a prince who had remembered his mother's words, and a princess who had made them real. The broadcast cut to black. No music, no commentary. No final analysis or expert opinion or scrolling ticker of reactions from around the world. Just silence, the deep, settling, almost sacred silence of a nation absorbing the truth that the future had arrived, and it looked nothing like the past.